My husband, Vance, only ever touched my lower back when we had an audience. The moment the front door clicked shut behind our dinner guests, his hand would drop from my spine like a lead weight, leaving a cold patch on my shirt where his palm had just been. "Clean up the kitchen before you come up," he said, not looking at me as he unbuttoned his cuffs and headed toward the stairs. "The grease from the roast is going to congeal if you leave it overnight." There was no warmth in his voice, no remnants of the attentive, doting husband who, just 20 minutes prior, had been pouring my wine and telling our neighbors how lost he would be without my grounding presence. I stood in the quiet of our pristine, minimalist kitchen, the smell of rosemary and expensive candles suddenly making me feel nauseous. I looked at the table, the linen napkins crumpled, the wine glasses smeared with grease, and felt the familiar, suffocating weight of my reality. Vance didn't hit me. He didn't yell. Instead, he practiced a form of emotional starvation that left no bruises, only an ache so deep I could feel it in my bones. For 4 years, I had lived in the space between his public adoration and his private indifference. To the world, we were the perfect couple, an ambitious architect and his supportive, artistic wife, living in a beautifully renovated townhouse in the historic district of Savannah. But inside these walls, I was little more than a piece of furniture that required occasional maintenance. I started stacking the plates, the porcelain clinking too loudly in the empty room. My fingers trembled slightly. It wasn't just the exhaustion of playing the happy wife for 3 hours. It was the realization that had been hardening inside me for the past month. Vance wasn't just cold anymore. He was shifting. Lately, his public displays of affection had grown more intense, almost performative, while his private silence had turned sharp, laced with a subtle, mocking condescension. When I spoke to him upstairs, he would look right through me, answering in monosyllables, if at all. But yesterday, at his firm's charity gala, he had kissed my cheek in front of his senior partner and whispered, loudly enough for others to hear, how proud he was of my recent pottery exhibition. An exhibition he hadn't even bothered to attend. I wiped down the marble countertop, my reflection caught in the dark window pane above the sink. I looked tired. At 32, I felt like an old house whose foundation was slowly giving way to rot, while the exterior got a fresh coat of paint every spring. As I turned off the kitchen lights, I noticed a flicker of light coming from the cracked door of Vance's home office on the second floor. Usually, he locked it. He was meticulous about his privacy, claiming his blueprints and client contracts were confidential. I walked up the stairs, my bare feet making no sound on the hardwood runner. The house was freezing. Vance liked the thermostat set low. I paused outside his office door, the silence stretching between us like a taut wire. Through the gap, I could see him sitting at his desk, the blue glow of his laptop illuminating the sharp angles of his face. He was typing rapidly, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips, a smile he never gave to me. Then his phone buzzed on the desk. He picked it up, read a message, and let out a soft, breathy laugh. It was the sound of a man who felt completely safe, completely connected to someone. I stood there in the dark hallway, the cold air biting at my ankles, realizing that the performance wasn't just for our friends anymore. The public kindness wasn't just to maintain his image. It was a shield. He was building a fortress of public perception, making sure everyone knew he loved me, so that when the floor finally dropped out from under our marriage, no one would ever believe it was his fault. I didn't open the door. I backed away slowly, retreating down the dark hallway into the guest bedroom, where I had been sleeping for the past 6 months under the guise of my erratic artistic schedule. I lay awake for hours, watching the shadows of the willow trees outside sway across the ceiling, listening to the rhythmic, distant hum of Vance's printer running late into the night. The next morning, the mask was back on before the coffee had even finished brewing. Vance came down the stairs dressed in his crisp gray suit, the scent of his expensive cologne cutting through the aroma of the hazelnut blend. "The Petersons invited us to their beach house in Tybee next weekend," he said, pouring himself a mug. He didn't look at me, keeping his eyes fixed on his tablet as he scrolled through the morning news. "I told them we'd love to come. Make sure you don't schedule any gallery deliveries for Saturday." "I have a kiln firing on Saturday, Vance," I said quietly, keeping my back to him as I rinsed a teaspoon. The pieces for the spring market need to be done. He set his mug down on the island. The sound was sharp, a miniature thunderclap in the quiet kitchen. When I turned, his eyes were locked on me, cold and unblinking. Jill, I'm trying to secure the Peterson account. It's a multi-million-dollar residential contract. Having you there, looking pleasant, acting supportive, is part of the equation. Surely your little clay pots can wait 24 hours. The phrase little clay pots stung, but I didn't let it show. I just tightened my grip on the edge of the sink. They aren't just pots, it's my livelihood. Your hobby, he corrected smoothly, standing up and picking up his briefcase. My income pays the mortgage on this house, Jill. It pays for the studio space you use. I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for a single weekend of cooperation. Before I could answer, the front doorbell rang. It was early, barely 8:00 a.m. Vance's expression shifted instantly. The tight, disdainful line of his mouth vanished, replaced by a warm, easy smile as he strode toward the foyer. I followed him at a distance. Opening the door, he greeted our mail carrier, a sweet older woman named Maeve who had been delivering to this block for a decade. Good morning, Maeve. Vance beamed, his voice booming with neighborly charm. You're out early today, staying dry out there. Trying to, Mr. Vance, Maeve smiled, handing him a stack of letters and a small parcel. She looked past his shoulder and caught sight of me. Morning, Jill. Oh, I saw the write-up about your pottery in the local paper last week. So proud of you. Vance didn't hesitate. He stepped back, wrapping a warm, heavy arm around my shoulders, pulling me tightly against his side. He squeezed me, a gesture that felt so incredibly loving to anyone watching from the porch. Isn't she incredible, Maeve? I keep telling her she underestimates her own talent. I'm just lucky to be riding her coattails. He looked down at me, his eyes crinkling with faux adoration, kissing the top of my head. I felt a chill run straight down my spine. The hypocrisy was so thick it made my chest ache. You're a good man, Vance, Maeve cooed, her eyes softening at the display. You two are just the sweetest. As soon as the door clicked shut, Vance's arm dropped. The warmth drained from his face so fast it was dizzying. He tossed the mail onto the entry table without a word, grabbed his keys, and walked out to his car, leaving me alone in the foyer with the lingering scent of his cologne and the crushing weight of his performance. But as I went to pick up the mail he had carelessly thrown down, my eyes snagged on a return address on one of the bank statements. It wasn't from our usual branch down the street. It was from a private wealth management firm in Atlanta, addressed solely to Vance. And the envelope was slightly torn at the corner, revealing a glimpse of a document titled Asset Restructuring and Separation Inventory. My heart did a slow, heavy roll in my chest. I stood in the quiet foyer, holding the crisp white envelope, my thumb brushing against the torn edge. Separation Inventory. The words felt like ice water in my veins. Vance wasn't just emotionally detached, he was calculating. He was planning his exit, and he was doing it with the same meticulous precision he used to design his buildings. I wanted to rip the envelope open right there, to tear through the paper and see exactly how much of our life he had already dismantled in secret. But I could hear the distant, low rumble of his garage door closing as he backed out of the driveway. He was gone, but his ghost always lingered in this house. He noticed everything. If a single piece of mail was out of order, if an envelope looked tampered with, he would know. I carefully placed the statement back into the middle of the stack, exactly how he had dropped it, ensuring the torn corner was tucked out of sight. I spent the rest of the morning in my studio, but for the first time in years, the clay felt dead in my hands. The wheels spun, a gray blur of wet earth, but my mind was stuck on the image of Vance's performative embrace on the porch. I'm just lucky to be riding her coattails. The words echoed in my head, turning sour. It wasn't just about his public image anymore. It was legal strategy. If everyone in Savannah believed he was a doting, supportive husband who worshipped his artistic wife, who would believe me when I told a judge that he had systematically frozen me out of our life? By late afternoon, the rain had started again, a dull, relentless tapping against the glass of the studio windows. I washed the gray clay from my hands, the cold water making my knuckles ache. I knew I couldn't just sit and wait for the axe to fall. I walked back over to the main house. The mail was gone from the entry table. Vance must have come back during his lunch break to retrieve it. That alone was telling. He never came home for lunch. I found myself standing at the foot of the stairs, looking up toward his home office. The door was closed, tightly shut this time. I walked up, the wood floor cold beneath my socks. I twisted the brass doorknob. Locked. I let out a shaky breath, pressing my forehead against the cool painted wood of the door. I needed to know what was on that laptop. I needed to know who was texting him at midnight and what was in that Atlanta bank account. But Vance didn't leave keys lying around. The silence of the house was interrupted by the chime of my own phone in my pocket. It was a text from Nora, Vance's younger sister. Nora was the only person in his family who ever really looked at me, though we were never exceptionally close. "Hey Jill, are you guys still coming to Dad's retirement dinner tonight? Vance said you might be too busy with your studio work, but I really hope you make it." I stared at the screen. Vance hadn't even mentioned a dinner to me. He was already rewriting my narrative to his family, painting me as the distant, self-absorbed artist who couldn't be bothered to show up for his father. I typed back immediately. "Of course we're coming, Nora. I wouldn't miss it for the world. What time should we be there?" When Vance came home at 6, he found me downstairs, fully dressed in a tailored black dress, fixing my earrings in the hallway mirror. He stopped dead in his tracks, his briefcase hanging at his side, a flicker of genuine annoyance crossing his face before he quickly smoothed it away. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice clipped. "Getting ready for your father's dinner," I said, turning to him with a calm smile that mirrored his own public mask. "Nora texted me. I told her we'd be there." Vance's jaw tightened, a tiny muscle twitching beneath his smooth skin. For a fraction of a second, I saw a flash of real panic in his eyes. He hadn't expected me to talk to his sister. He hadn't prepared for me to step off the script he was writing. "You should have asked me first," Vance said, his voice dropping into that dangerously quiet register he used when he was losing control of a room. He set his briefcase down on the bench, his movements slow and deliberate. "I told them you were exhausted from preparing for the market. I was trying to protect your time, Jill." "I appreciate the thought," I replied, smoothing down the front of my dress, keeping my voice entirely even. "But family is important. I'd hate for your father to think I didn't care enough to show up." We stared at each other in the dim light of the foyer. The tension was thick, palpable, a living thing suffocating the space between us. For the first time in our marriage, I didn't flinch under his gaze. I didn't offer an apology or a placating excuse. I just stood there, matching his coldness with a quiet rigidity of my own. The drive to his parents' house in Ardsley Park was 40 minutes of absolute silence. Vance kept his eyes locked on the wet asphalt, his knuckles white against the leather-wrapped steering wheel. He didn't turn on the radio. The only sound was the rhythmic, hypnotic slap of the windshield wipers clearing the heavy mist. But the moment he pulled into his parents' gravel driveway, the transformation began. I watched his shoulders drop, his facial muscles relaxing, the sharp line of his jaw softening into an expression of easy warmth. By the time he walked around to open my passenger door, he was a completely different man. "Watch your steps, sweetheart," he murmured, offering his hand. His fingers were warm, closing firmly around mine. To anyone looking out the living room window, it was the epitome of chivalry. He kept his hand in mine as we walked up the brick steps, his thumb gently rubbing the back of my knuckles. The contrast made my skin crawl. The front door opened before we could ring the bell. Nora stood there, her face instantly lighting up when she saw me. "Jill, you made it," she said, stepping forward to pull me into a hug. Over her shoulder, I saw Vance's parents, Arthur and Corrine, sitting in the living room. "Of course I did," I said, leaning into the embrace. "I wouldn't miss celebrating your dad." "Vance made it sound like you were practically chained to your pottery wheel," Nora laughed, pulling back to look at me. Vance stepped in smoothly, his arm sliding around my waist, pulling me tightly against his flank. "You know how she gets when she's in the zone," he joked, his voice full of fond indulgence. He looked down at me, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "I practically had to drag her away, but I knew she'd regret missing tonight. She cares about you guys too much." Arthur rose from his armchair, lifting his glass. "Good to see you, Jill. Glad my son could pry you away from your masterpieces for one evening." The dinner was an exercise in psychological endurance. Vance sat next to me, his hand resting on my thigh beneath the tablecloth, a heavy, constant reminder of his presence. Throughout the meal, he steered the conversation masterfully. He talked about our upcoming trip to Tybee Island, about how much he admired my work ethic, about how he was trying to build a legacy for us. He was painting a portrait of a blissful, intertwined life, laying down a thick layer of public testimony. But as the plates were cleared and Corinne went to the kitchen to fetch the dessert, Arthur looked across the table at Vance, his expression turning serious. "So, Vance," Arthur said, leaning forward, "have you finalized those legal arrangements we discussed with the Atlanta firm? The market is shifting, son. You need to make sure your personal assets are secured before the end of the quarter." My breath caught in my throat, but I forced my expression to remain entirely neutral, keeping my eyes fixed on my half-empty water glass. The Atlanta firm. The private wealth management documents I had seen earlier that morning suddenly clicked into place. This wasn't just Vance acting alone out of spite. His father was actively helping him orchestrate the financial extraction. Vance's hand on my thigh tightened just a fraction of an inch, not a loving squeeze, but a warning pressure that meant stay still, don't move, don't say a word. "Everything is on track, Dad," Vance said smoothly, his voice devoid of even a hint of hesitation. He chuckled, a rich, easy sound that filled the dining room. "But let's not talk about boring legal structures tonight. This evening is about your retirement. Jill and I want to toast to you." He lifted his wine glass, looking across the table at his father with a look of intense, shared understanding. Arthur nodded, a slow, approving gesture, and raised his own glass. They didn't look at me. In that brief exchange, I realized exactly where I stood. To the world, I was the cherished wife. To this family, I was a liability to be quietly and legally managed before the doors were thrown open. Nora looked between her father and brother, her brow furrowing slightly. "What legal arrangements, Dad? I thought you were just dissolving the old partnership." "Just standard estate planning, Nora," Vance intervened before his father could speak, his tone dripping with protective older brother condescension. He turned to me, his eyes melting into that familiar, deceptive warmth. "Right, sweetheart. We're just making sure our future is set up correctly. Jill knows how tedious all the paperwork can be." "Oh, absolutely," I said, meeting his gaze directly. I smiled, letting the corners of my mouth lift just enough to look entirely compliant. Vance is always so thorough when it comes to protecting what's his. A fleeting shadow of doubt crossed Vance's eyes. He wasn't used to me pushing back, even with a double entendre hidden beneath a smile. But before he could analyze my comment, Corinne returned from the kitchen carrying a lemon tart, and the conversation drifted back into safe, superficial waters. For the rest of the evening, I played my part to perfection. I laughed at Arthur's old stories, helped Corinne clear the dessert plates, and kept my posture relaxed. But internally, a cold, sharp clarity had taken over. I wasn't sad anymore. The grief of losing the man I thought I married was entirely replaced by the primal instinct to survive him. When we finally said our goodbyes on the porch, Vance wrapped his arm around my waist, pulling me close to shield me from the damp night air. "Get home safe, you too," Corinne waved from the doorway. The moment the car doors slammed shut and the headlights cut through the dark Ardsley Park streets, the warmth evaporated. Vance released the steering wheel with one hand to loosen his silk tie, his chest rising and falling in a heavy, irritated sigh. "You shouldn't have brought up my father's legal business in front of Nora," he said, his voice sharp and clinical. "She doesn't need to be involved in family finances." "I didn't bring it up, Vance. Your father did," I replied quietly, staring out at the passing streetlights. "Well, your little comment wasn't necessary," he snapped, his eyes fixed on the road. "Just stick to the script, Jill. It's not that hard." I didn't answer. I just watched the rain slide down the side window. He thought he was the only one playing a game. He thought I was still the fragile, oblivious artist who would be left with nothing but a pile of clay when he finally handed me the divorce papers. He had no idea that tomorrow morning, While he was at his office designing structures for other people, I was going to start dismantling his. The next morning, I waited exactly 40 minutes after his car cleared the driveway before I went upstairs. The house possessed a heavy, hollow stillness that felt almost predatory. My chest was tight, but my hands were entirely steady. I stopped at the threshold of Vance's home office. The brass doorknob was cold, and as expected, it didn't budge when I turned it. But Vance had a blind spot. He believed his intellectual superiority was an absolute shield. He thought I was too passive, too disconnected from reality to ever challenge him. He didn't realize that when you live with an emotional ghost for 4 years, you learn to watch every movement, every shadow, and every habit. I walked down the hall to the master bathroom and opened the small velvet tray where he kept his spare watch links and collar stays. Tucked beneath a velvet lining was a small, silver key. He had used it once 6 months ago in front of me to lock a drawer, a fleeting second he had likely forgotten, but I hadn't. When I inserted the key into the office door, the lock slid open with a soft, metallic click that felt like a gunshot in the silent house. I stepped inside. The air smelled of old paper and the leather of his desk chair. I didn't touch his laptop. He was meticulous enough to have tracking software or access logs. Instead, I bypassed the desk and kneeled in front of the small, locked filing cabinet beneath his drafting table. The same silver key worked. I pulled the bottom drawer open. My eyes skimmed past blueprints and tax returns from our early years of marriage until I found a thick, unmarked manila folder tucked at the very back. Inside was a copy of the private wealth statement from Atlanta, but underneath it lay something far worse. It was a completely mapped-out timeline of our asset separation, drafted by his attorney over 3 months ago. There were printouts of my studio's minor business account, highlighted in yellow, along with a formal appraisal of our historic townhouse, an appraisal that had been conducted while I was away at an art workshop in North Carolina. But it was the final page that made the blood roar in my ears. It was a signed affidavit from Vance, waiting to be filed. In it, he claimed that I was emotionally unstable, prone to erratic artistic outbursts, and had completely checked out of the marriage, forcing him to maintain our home and public life alone. He was building a legal case that painted me as a volatile dependent, a strategy designed to strip me of any spousal support, my studio space, and the equity in the home I had helped renovate with my own hands. Attached to the back of the affidavit were color printouts of text messages. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. They weren't texts between him and a lawyer. They were messages between Vance and a woman named Linnea, the junior partner he had introduced me to at the charity gala. "She has no idea," one message from Vance read, dated 2 weeks prior. "The dinner with the Petersons is set. Once the contract is signed under our joint names as a married couple, I'll file. Everyone in town thinks I'm a saint for putting up with her. It's almost too easy." I sat on the cold floor, the papers trembling slightly in my grip. The public affection, the hand on my lower back, the kisses on my head in front of the mail carrier. It wasn't just to look good. He was actively creating a living record of his devotion to contrast against the fictional portrait of my instability. He needed the Peterson contract signed first, using our stable family image as leverage, before cutting me loose with nothing. I heard a sudden, sharp rustle down the hallway. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, my eyes darting toward the open office door, my muscles locked into stone. I sat perfectly still on the hardwood floor, the color printouts of Vance's Betrayal clutched tightly in my hands. The sound came again, a heavy, rhythmic scuffing downstairs. I carefully slid the papers back into the manila folder, my fingers working with frantic precision. I closed the filing cabinet drawer, turned the key, and slipped it into my dress pocket. Creeping to the top of the stairs, I peered down over the banister, my throat dry. It was just the automated vacuum cleaner, bumping mindlessly against the baseboards of the living room. I let out a long, ragged breath, my forehead resting against the cool drywall of the staircase. The panic receded, leaving behind a cold, crystalline fury. I wasn't just dealing with a husband who didn't love me anymore. I was dealing with a predator who was trying to erase me. "It's almost too easy," he had texted Linnea. He truly believed I was a ghost in my own life. I walked down to the kitchen, my mind racing. I couldn't just confront him. If I showed my hand now, he would destroy the evidence, accelerate the filing, and use his established network of influence in the city to paint me exactly as his affidavit described. Erratic, hysterical, unstable. I needed to let him think his plan was working perfectly. I needed him to believe I was completely blind. I pulled out my phone and dialed a number I hadn't called in years. It belonged to Priya, an old college friend who had gone into family law up in Atlanta, far outside the tight-knit, gossipy legal circles of Savannah. "Jill," Priya's voice came through the line, warm and surprised. "My God, it's been forever. How are things down coast?" "Priya," I said, my voice cracking slightly before I forced it to steady. I walked to the window, watching the gray rain beat against the hydrangeas in the courtyard. "I need your help, professionally, and it has to be completely confidential." The warmth left Priya's voice instantly, replaced by the sharp, focused tone of a seasoned attorney. "Tell me everything." I spent the next 20 minutes outlining the timeline, the Atlanta wealth management documents, the appraisal done behind my back, and the text messages with Linnea. I told her about the performative kindness, the heavy hand on my back, and the trap Vance was setting for the Peterson dinner next weekend. When I finished, there was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. "He's good, Jill," Priya said quietly. "If he files that affidavit with character references from your neighbors and his partners saying he's a doting husband while you're reclusive and unstable, a local judge might actually lean his way on asset division. In Georgia, judges have broad discretion. He's rigging the game before it even starts." "How do I unrig it?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. "You play the part he's written for you, but you change the ending," Priya instructed. "He needs that Peterson contract signed next weekend, right? He needs you to look like the perfect, supportive wife to secure a multi-million-dollar account. We're going to give him exactly what he wants. But while he's focused on that stage, you're going to document every single discrepancy between his public performance and his private neglect. I want recordings, Jill, digital trails. And most importantly, we need to locate where he's hiding the marital funds he's already moved to Atlanta. And if I can't find the accounts, then he walks away with everything, and you leave with nothing but your clay pots," Priya said bluntly. "You have 1 week before that Tybee Island dinner, Jill. Don't blink." That evening, when Vance came home, he didn't even say hello. He walked straight past me to the kitchen, poured a glass of scotch, and sat down at the island, immediately opening his laptop. I stood by the stove, stirring a pot of soup. I looked at his profile, the sharp, handsome angles that used to bring me comfort, now looking completely alien. "How was your day?" I asked quietly, testing the waters. "Fine," he muttered, not looking up from the screen. "Brutal. I don't have the energy for small talk tonight, Jill." I walked over to him, carrying a small bowl of soup. As I set it down beside his laptop, I deliberately let my hand brush his shoulder. He flinched, shifting his weight away from my touch as if I were a mild inconvenience. "I looked up the weather for Tybee Island next weekend," I said, keeping my voice soft, yielding, entirely compliant. "It looks like it's going to be beautiful. I've already postponed my kiln firing. I want to make sure everything goes perfectly with the Petersons." Vance paused, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. He finally looked up at me, a slow, triumphant smile spreading across his face. It was the smile of a man who believed his chess piece had just moved exactly where he wanted it to. "Good girl," he murmured, his voice dripping with that patronizing warmth he usually reserved for the public. He reached out and patted my hand briefly before turning back to his screen. "I knew you'd see reason." I turned back to the counter so he couldn't see my face. My hand in my pocket was gripping the silver key to his office so hard the metal bit into my palm. He thought the trap was closing around me. He had no idea I was the one holding the key. Over the next 4 days, I became a ghost who kept meticulous records. Every time Vance came home, I kept my phone in my apron pocket, the voice recorder running. The audio files accumulated in a hidden cloud drive Priya had set up for me. Hours of heavy, icy silence, punctuated by his sharp, clinical dismissals. "Don't sit so close to me, Jill, I'm working." "Did you actually spend money on more glaze this week? You're draining the household account on a hobby." "If anyone asks at the charity luncheon tomorrow, you love the new townhouse layout. Don't embarrass me with your rustic design opinions." But the real battle was upstairs. Every afternoon, during the narrow 2-hour window when Vance was tied up in executive meetings at his firm, I went into his office. My heart still hammered against my ribs every time the silver key turned in the lock, but my hands no longer shook. I didn't try to hack his laptop. Instead, I focused on the physical trail. Vance was a creature of habit. He liked paper backups for his legal records, a trait he inherited from his old-school father. On Wednesday, tucked inside a hollowed-out architecture directory on his shelf, I found what Priya needed: the routing numbers for the private wealth management firm in Atlanta. He had already moved nearly $200,000 of our shared savings into a sole signature account under a shell corporation named Vanguard Designs, LLC. I took crisp, clear photos of every page with my phone, uploaded them to Priya, and carefully put everything back exactly as it was, down to the millimeter. By Friday evening, the atmosphere in the house was thick with unspoken finality. We were packing our bags for the Petersons' beach house in Tybee Island. Vance was in a remarkably good mood, his vanity fed by the proximity of the massive contract. "Make sure you pack that cream linen dress I bought you for the dinner tomorrow night," he said, standing in the doorway of my guest room, watching me fold my clothes. "The Petersons are traditionalists. They like a woman who looks classic." "Of course," I said, keeping my back to him as I smoothed down the fabric. "Whatever helps secure the account, Vance." He lingered for a moment, his eyes scanning my small, sparse bedroom. For a fraction of a second, a look of strange, detached pity crossed his face. "You've been very cooperative this week, Jill. I appreciate it. It's good for us." "I'm just doing what a supportive wife should do," I replied, turning to give him a mild, compliant smile. The underlying cruelty of his gaze returned, masked by a patronizing nod. He thought he was looking at a beaten dog that had finally learned to stop barking. He had no idea that Priya had filed our counterpetition in a private Atlanta court just 3 hours ago, completely out of sight of the Savannah legal network. Saturday morning split open with brilliant, blinding coastal sunshine. The drive to Tybee Island was the usual performance. The moment we crossed the bridge over the salt marshes, Vance reached across the center console and took my hand, gripping it tightly as he steered with the other. Anyone passing us on Highway 80 would have seen a beautiful, affluent couple heading out for a romantic beach weekend. When we pulled up to the Petersons' sprawling, multi-million-dollar oceanfront estate, Hoyt Peterson and his wife, Cheryl, were already out on the wraparound porch, holding glasses of iced tea. Vance stepped out of the car, his face instantly illuminating with that dazzling, charismatic smile. He jogged around to my side, opening the door and extending his hand to help me out. "Here we are, sweetheart," he murmured loudly enough for the Petersons to hear, his arm immediately wrapping around my waist, pulling me firmly against his side as we walked up the steps. "The beautiful artist has arrived. I told you I'd bring her, Hoyt." Hoyt laughed, stepping forward to shake Vance's hand. "Good to see you, Vance. Jill, you look absolutely radiant. We are so glad you could make it. Vance told us how demanding your exhibition schedule has been lately." "I wouldn't miss it for the world, Hoyt," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly pitched. I looked up at Vance, leaning into his side, feeling the tense, rigid muscle of his ribcage beneath his polo shirt. "Vance tells me so much about you both. He always says our life wouldn't be where it is without your guidance." Vance's arm tightened around me in a brief, triumphant squeeze. I could feel the sheer relief radiating off him. He thought the stage was set. He thought he was hours away from signing the contract of his career and executing the perfect, painless emotional execution of his wife. He didn't notice the silent notification that buzzed against my thigh from the phone in my pocket. It was a single text from Priya. "Atlanta assets frozen under emergency injunction. He'll get the notice on his phone in exactly 2 hours. Sit tight." The afternoon on Tybee Island dragged on with agonizing, sun-drenched slowness. We sat on the Petersons' expansive teak deck, the sound of the Atlantic surf crashing violently against the shore below. To Hoyt and Cheryl, we were a picture-perfect postcard of marital bliss. Vance sat close to me, his arm draped casually over the back of my chair, his fingers occasionally brushing my shoulder as he expertly navigated Hoyt through the final nuances of the architectural blueprints. Every time he laughed, every time he leaned in to murmur a sweet, performative aside to me, my pulse hammered in my ears. I kept my hands folded in my lap, my fingers tightly interlaced to hide the slight tremor. I kept glancing at the sleek black face of Vance's phone resting on the outdoor table, just inches from his iced drink. "We really want this project to feel organic, Vance," Hoyt said, leaning back and lighting a cigar. "The coastal environment is brutal. We need someone who respects the landscape, someone with a grounded foundation. Cheryl and I always say you can tell a man's stability by how he treats his home." Vance smiled, squeezing my shoulder with practiced tenderness. "I couldn't agree more, Hoyt. Jill is my anchor. Every design I pull off is rooted in the stability she gives me at home. Honestly, I'd be entirely adrift without her." "You two are just a breath of fresh air," Cheryl cooed, setting down her glass. "In a town full of messy divorces and superficial couples, you can just feel the real devotion between you." "Thank you, Cheryl," I said, looking her straight in the eyes. My voice didn't waver. "Vance has always been very careful about what he lets the world see." Vance's fingers tightened on my shoulder just a fraction too hard, a subtle warning to stay within the boundaries of my script. He cleared his throat, smoothly redirecting the conversation. "Well, Hoyt, I brought the finalized contract documents along with the structural amendments we discussed. I can pull them up on my tablet whenever you're ready to sign." "Let's do it now before dinner," Hoyt smiled, raising his glass. "No sense in letting good business spoil a fine steak." Vance reached for his phone first, intending to check his notifications before opening his briefcase. My heart leaped into my throat. The 2-hour mark Priya had predicted had just passed. He tapped the screen. The blue light illuminated his eyes. I watched his face closely, searching for the exact micro-expression, the slight tremor in his jaw, the split-second widening of his pupils. The screen flashed with an alert. It wasn't a standard text message. It was an urgent, high-priority email notification from his private wealth management firm in Atlanta, immediately followed by a frantic text from his father, Arthur. The easy, charismatic smile on Vance's face froze. The color drained from his lips so quickly they turned a strange, sickly shade of gray. The hand that held the phone began to stiffen, his knuckles turning white. "Everything all right, Vance?" Hoyt asked, pausing as he reached for his reading glasses. Vance didn't answer right away. His breathing had gone shallow. He stared at the screen, reading the words that were legally dismantling his secret fortress. "All assets under Vanguard Designs LLC frozen due to pending litigation. Case number 2026 CV 8411. "Vance," Hoyt prompted again, his brow furrowing slightly at the sudden, icy silence that had fallen over his guest. Vance slowly looked up from his phone, his eyes darting to me. For the first time in 4 years, the mask was completely shattered. Beneath it lay a raw, terrifying mixture of pure shock, unbridled fury, and a sudden, desperate panic. He looked at me as if he were seeing a stranger standing in his living room holding a loaded weapon. "Jill," he whispered, his voice dangerously thin, completely stripping away the warm, resonant tone he had used only seconds before. "What did you do?" "What did I do?" I asked, my voice dropping into a calm, measured register that seemed to hang perfectly in the salt air. I didn't flinch. I didn't look away. I simply reached over and took a slow sip of my iced tea, letting the ice cubes clink against the glass in the sudden, deafening silence. Hoyt and Cheryl exchanged a confused, uncomfortable glance. The easy, warm atmosphere on the deck had vanished, replaced by a sudden, jagged tension. "Is something wrong, Vance?" Hoyt asked, his voice losing its jovial warmth, replaced by the sharp, observant tone of a businessman who smelled a sudden shift in the wind. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Vance didn't answer Hoyt. He couldn't. His eyes were locked on mine, burning with a frantic, desperate rage. His jaw muscle was twitching violently. He stood up so fast his teak chair scraped loudly against the deck boards, the sound like a small shriek. "Hoyt, Cheryl, please excuse us for just a moment," Vance said, his public voice fracturing at the edges as he forced a hollow, terrifying imitation of a smile. "Jill and I need to step inside and discuss a minor household emergency that just came up." "Vance, if it's about the Atlanta accounts, there's really nothing to discuss out here," I said quietly, remaining seated. I looked up at him, my expression entirely serene, the image of the compliant, placid wife he had spent months cultivating. His breath hitched. The mention of Atlanta in front of Hoyt Peterson, a man who valued financial transparency and stability above all else, was a direct hit. "Jill," Vance hissed, bending down under the guise of an intimate whisper, though his hands were trembling as he gripped the back of my chair. "Shut up. Walk inside, now." "Is everything all right, Jill?" Cheryl asked, leaning forward, her instinct for family drama overriding her polite Southern manners. She looked at Vance's white-knuckled grip on my chair, then at my completely calm demeanor. The illusion of our perfect marriage was cracking right before their eyes. "Everything is perfectly fine, Cheryl," I said, finally standing up and smoothing down the front of my cream linen dress. I looked at Vance, letting him see the absolute lack of fear in my eyes. "Vance is just a little stressed. Why don't you check your messages, Vance? I think your father is trying to reach you, too." Right on cue, his phone began to vibrate violently in his hand. The screen lit up with Arthur's name. Vance stared at the flashing screen, then back at me. He was trapped on a stage of his own making. If he yelled at me, if he lost his temper, he would prove everything I had just filed in the Atlanta courts, and he would instantly lose the Peterson contract. If he stayed quiet, his entire financial empire would remain frozen while he stood here pretending to be a happy husband. "Excuse me," Vance muttered, his voice strangled. He didn't wait for a response. He turned on his heel and strode down the deck steps toward the beach, pressing the phone to his ear, his shoulders rigid and hunched as he began to pace furiously on the sand below. Hoyt watched him go, his mouth set in a hard, disapproving line. Then he turned his gaze back to me, his eyes narrowing. "Jill, what is going on here?" I sat back down, folding my hands in my lap. The ocean breeze blew a strand of hair across my face, and for the first time in 4 years, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt entirely alive. "Hoyt," I said smoothly, looking him directly in the eye, "I think you and Cheryl should know the truth about the man you're about to do business with."